Picture this, mate. It's the dead of night. The sea's gone black as pitch, and the wind's screaming like something alive. Timber's snapping, waves are climbing higher than houses, and men who've spent their whole lives on the ocean suddenly realize they're completely stuffed. Now here's the chilling bit. This wasn't some half-forgotten squall. This was the deadliest natural disaster in Australia's recorded history. Cyclone Mahina. March 4th, 1899. Far north Queensland along the remote stretch of coast near Bathurst Bay, right at the top of Cape York. And before the sun came up, hundreds of people were dead, buried under sand, wreckage, and seawater, wiped off the map in a single savage night. Back then, there were no satellite warnings, no radio alerts, no bloke on the telly telling you to evacuate. Just a hot, heavy calm and a gut feeling that something wasn't right. Purling luggers filled the bay, crews made up of Europeans, Aboriginal workers, Pacific Islanders, all chasing shells worth a fortune. They reckoned they'd ridden out rough weather before. She'll be right, yeah? But Mahina wasn't here to play fair. This monster cyclone drove a storm surge so massive it shoved the sea kilometers inland, piling sand dunes higher than rooftops and snapping ships like matchsticks. Some people drowned where they stood. Others were flung into the darkness, never found. Entire camps vanished. No graves, bugger all left behind. Even today, the exact death toll is still argued over, but most reckon at least 300 souls were lost, maybe far more. And the scariest part? Most of Australia had no idea it even happened. What really went on in that black, howling night? How did seasoned sailors, families, and whole communities get caught so completely off guard? And what kind of force can bury people alive and erase them from history in just a few hours? Stick around, because once you hear what survivors saw, heard, and felt as Cyclone Mahina came ashore, you'll never look at the ocean the same way again. In the days leading up to it, there were signs, but no one quite joined the dots. Late February of 1899 had been stinking hot, the kind of heat that presses down on your chest and won't let you breathe properly. The sea off Cape York went strangely still, like it was holding its breath. Old hands noticed it straight away. Pearlers had a saying up there: when the water turns oily and the air goes dead quiet, something ugly's on the way. But ugly weather was part of life, and work didn't stop just because your neck hairs stood up. Bathurst Bay was packed. Dozens of purling luggers were anchored close together, sails furled, crews busy repairing lines, sorting shell, cooking tucker. John O'Mac-Leod, a Scotsman who'd been purling since he was a teen, later said the sky that afternoon looked wrong, like it had been bruised. A dull greenish-gray, low and heavy. He told a mate, "Reckon we should move out," but the mate just laughed. They'd ridden out cyclones before. Anchor down, ride it out, earn your pay. Simple as that bar. Inshore, small camps dotted the coastline. Aboriginal families, South Sea Islander workers, Chinese cooks, a handful of Europeans. Tin shacks, canvas tents, nothing built to last. Sheila Dawes was there with her husband Tom, running supplies to the luggers. She remembered the birds going quiet first. No squawking, no flapping, just gone. Even the insects shut up. It felt like the world was watching us, she said later, like it knew something we didn't. By sunset on March the 3rd, the wind started to pick up, slow at first, teasing. Palm fronds rattled, ropes creaked, waves slapped against hulls harder than usual. Mick O'Rourke, skipper of a lugger called the Sea Belle, ordered his crew to double-check the anchors. He didn't like the look of the clouds, thick and stacked on top of each other, climbing higher by the minute. Still, no one talked about abandoning ship. Where would you go? The bush was miles of scrub and mangrove. The boats were all they had. As darkness fell, the wind shifted suddenly, swinging around hard and fast. That's when the rain came, not drops but sheets, stinging your skin like gravel. Tents collapsed within minutes, fires were snuffed out. Daza Ing, a young deckhand barely 20, remembered yelling to be heard over the rising roar. "It's blowing up big," he shouted, panic creeping into his voice. By then, the sea was already rising, crawling up the beach in a way that made no sense. No one knew Mahina was bearing down with terrifying speed. No barometer warnings reached them in time, no telegrams, no chance to run. The cyclone tightened around Bathurst Bay like a fist. Masts began snapping with sharp cracks that echoed through the night. Boats slammed into each other, hulls grinding, men scrambling in the dark, hands slipping on rain-soaked timber. On land, the first surge came like a wall, not a wave, but the sea itself lifting and charging forward. Sheila felt the ground vanish under her feet. Tom grabbed her arm and yelled something she never heard. Water rushed past her waist, her chest, cold and violent. In minutes, sand was moving, dunes shifting as if they were alive. People ran blindly, crashing into each other, screaming names that were ripped away by the wind. Out in the bay, anchors dragged. One by one, luggers broke free, tossed around like toys. Jono clung to a rail as his boat reared up, then dropped sickeningly. Somewhere nearby, he heard a man praying. Somewhere else, a scream cut short. The wind howled so loud it drowned out everything else, a constant, unrelenting roar that made it impossible to think. And this was only the beginning. The eye of Cyclone Mahina was still hours away, still gathering strength, still pushing more ocean toward the shore. As the tide kept climbing and the night grew even darker, the people of Bathurst Bay had no idea that what they were facing next would make everything so far feel almost merciful. Sometime after midnight, the cyclones stopped playing games. The wind went from savage to downright unreal, a shrieking wall of noise that flattened everything in its path. Blokes later swore it sounded like 10 trains screaming through the dark at once. You couldn't stand, you couldn't crawl. You just clung on and hoped whatever you were holding stayed where it was. Cyclone Mahina had reached full fury, and Bathurst Bay was dead center in its grip. Out on the water, the sea wasn't waves anymore. It was chaos. Luggers were lifted clean out of the bay, hurled inland like scraps of bark. Mick O'Rourke felt his boat rise straight up, higher than he'd ever imagined possible, before smashing down with a crack that split timber like firewood. The mast went first, then the deck. Men were thrown into the blackness, swallowed instantly. Mick never saw his first mate again. 1 second he was there, the next he was gone, like the storm had plucked him out of the world. On shore, the storm surge hit its peak. A wall of seawater higher than a double-story house rushed kilometers inland. Sand dunes didn't just shift, they exploded, burying camps, huts, people. Daza-ing was running blind, arms outstretched, when the ground suddenly rose in front of him and smashed into his chest. A dune, moving like a living thing. He was slammed under, lungs burning, mouth full of grit and salt. He thought, "This is it, I'm done." Somehow, by pure dumb luck, he clawed his way free and rolled into a hollow, pressed flat as debris screamed overhead. Sheila Dawes never let go of Tom's hand until the water tore them apart. She was smashed against something solid, maybe a tree, maybe a boat, she never knew. The pressure pinned her there while waves crashed over her head again and again. She remembered thinking about her mum back in Cooktown, about a half-finished letter she'd never sent. Then, just as suddenly, the water dropped away, leaving her gasping in the mud, alone in the dark. And then came the strangest moment of all. The wind eased, not stopped, but eased. The rain softened. For a brief, eerie stretch of time, there was something close to calm. The eye of Mahina had passed overhead. Survivors stumbled out from wreckage, blinking, bleeding, calling names into the darkness. Jono MacLeod found himself standing on sand that hadn't been there hours before, surrounded by smashed boats lying impossibly far from the shoreline. He shouted for his crew. No answer. Just the distant moan of wind and the hiss of water draining away. Brr. Thought it was over. A cruel mistake. Old hands knew better, and they screamed warnings into the half-light, but exhaustion dulled everything. People collapsed where they stood, bodies shaking, minds numb. A few even tried to help the injured, ripping shirts into bandages, dragging mates clear of debris. They had no idea the cyclone was about to come back from the opposite direction, just as vicious, just as deadly. And the wind returned. It hit harder than before, slamming into battered bodies with renewed rage. The second surge of water surged over land already stripped bare, ripping up whatever Mahina had spared the first time. Boats that had survived were finally smashed to pieces. Trees snapped like matchsticks. Those who'd crawled out of hiding were caught in the open with nowhere left to run. As dawn crept closer, the storm slowly began to move on, leaving behind a silence that felt wrong, heavy, and final. But as the light started to reveal what Mahina had done, the true scale of the horror was only just beginning to show itself. When daylight finally broke on March the 4th, it didn't bring relief. It brought disbelief. The sun rose over a coastline that no longer made sense. Bathurst Bay had been reshaped, twisted into something unrecognizable. The shoreline was kilometers inland from where it used to be. Boats lay scattered across the land like they'd fallen out of the sky, some smashed to splinters, others sitting upright on top of sand dunes taller than houses. The air stank of salt, mud, and death. John O'Macleod walked barefoot through wreckage, calling out names until his throat burned. Everywhere he looked, there were bits of lives torn apart, a cooking pot wedged in a tree, a torn sail wrapped around a broken mast. Bodies lay half buried in sand, limbs twisted, faces unrecognizable. He found one of his crew later that morning, pinned under timber, eyes open, filled with sand. Jono dropped to his knees and just stared. No tears. Nothing left in him. Earther inland, survivors stumbled out of mangroves and hollows like ghosts. Daza Eng was bleeding from a deep gash on his scalp, his clothes shredded, skin raw from sandblast. He kept muttering the same thing over and over. The ground moved. The bloody ground moved. No one laughed. Everyone had seen it. Sand dunes had rolled like waves, swallowing camps whole. People hadn't drowned. They'd been buried alive. Sheila Dawes was found hours later by a small group searching the debris. She was sitting against a broken hull, staring at nothing, hands still clenched as if holding someone's fingers. When they told her Tom was gone, she didn't cry. She just whispered, he promised he wouldn't let go. Around her, other women searched for children, sisters, mates. Most searches ended in silence. There was no organized rescue, no outside help. The place was too remote, too cut off. Anyone who survived had to become their own rescuer. Men dug with bare hands, ripping away sand and wreckage, driven by hope and desperation. Every now and then someone would shout, hearts would leap, and then fall again when it was just another body. The numbers kept climbing. Dozens, then hundreds. Out in what remained of the bay, the sea was eerily calm again, like it was done with its work. Floating debris stretched as far as the eye could see. Purling luggers that had once been a man's livelihood were gone. Entire crews vanished without a trace. Some bodies were never found at all, likely carried back out to sea or buried so deep under sand they're still there today. If your family's ever passed down stories of cyclones, floods, or bushfires that nearly wiped them out, drop them in the comments below. These stories don't live in history books alone. They live in families, and they deserve a fair go at being remembered. As the hours turned into days, the survivors faced another brutal reality. No food, bugger all fresh water, injuries turning septic in the heat, flies thick on wounds and corpses alike. A few makeshift camps formed on higher ground, people sharing whatever they could salvage. Someone found a barrel of rainwater. Someone else found a sack. K of rice soaked in seawater. It wasn't much, but it kept them breathing. Messages were eventually sent south when a damaged vessel managed to limp away. When word finally reached the rest of Queensland, disbelief followed. How could so many people die in one night and no one know? Official counts struggled to keep up. Names were missing, records were poor. Many of the dead were Aboriginal workers or Pacific Islanders whose lives were barely documented at all. For them, there would be no headlines, just absence. As the shock settled in, one thing became painfully clear. Cyclone Mahina hadn't just killed people, it had erased them. And standing there among the ruins, the survivors couldn't shake the feeling that Australia itself had just been warned, and might not be listening yet. In the weeks that followed, the silence became almost unbearable. Once the immediate shock faded, grief settled in heavy and slow, like the humidity after rain. Survivors moved through the wreckage with hollow eyes, doing what had to be done because there was no other choice. Bodies that could be found were buried in shallow graves scratched into sand that still shifted underfoot. Some were wrapped in sailcloth, others had nothing at all, a name spoken, a short pause, then on to the next. That was how you survived it. You didn't linger. John O'Mac-Leod helped bury more mates than he could count. He stopped saying their names out loud because it hurt too much. At night he couldn't sleep. Every time the wind picked up, even just a breeze, his body tensed like the storm was coming back. He'd stare out toward the bay, replaying the sound of timber cracking. The screams cut short. He reckoned part of him was still out there in the dark, hanging onto that rail burr. Azaeng never went near the dunes again. The sight of sand piled high made his chest tighten. He'd wake up coughing, convinced he was. Buried, hands clawing at nothing. During the day, he worked alongside the others, salvaging whatever could be used. A plank here, a bit of rope there. It was busy work, really, but it kept his mind from drifting back to that moment when the ground rose up and tried to kill him. Sheila Dawes left Bathurst Bay as soon as she could. There was nothing left for her there. No home, no husband, just ghosts. She boarded a southbound vessel weeks later, thinner, quieter, carrying Tom's battered pocket knife in her bag. She never spoke about the cyclone again, not properly. But those who knew her said she flinched at loud noises for the rest of her life, and she never slept through a storm. News of the disaster slowly filtered through Queensland and beyond, but it never landed the way it should have. The place was too far away. The people who died were too often the kind Australia didn't pay much attention to back then. Pearlers, laborers, Aboriginal families, no photographs of the dead, no dramatic headlines splashed across city papers for long. Cyclone Mahina slipped into history as a footnote, despite being the deadliest storm the country had ever seen. For the pearling industry, it was devastating. Whole fleets were gone, investors pulled out, camps were abandoned. Some men swore they'd never return to the sea. Others did, because it was all they knew, but with a new fear riding every calm horizon. The idea that the ocean could rise up and bury you alive never really left them. Quietly, lessons began to sink in. Anchoring close together was dangerous. Low-lying camps were death traps. The sea surge, not the wind, was the real killer. But without modern forecasting, those lessons came written in blood. Years would pass before weather monitoring improved, before warnings could travel faster than the storm itself. The land around Bathurst Bay carried the scars for decades. Massive dunes sat where camps once stood. Rusted fragments of boats would sometimes poke out after heavy rain, reminders of what lay beneath. Locals spoke about places you didn't camp, places that felt wrong. They said the ground there remembered, and for those who lived through Mahina, life was forever split in two, before the cyclone and after. Before, the sea was dangerous but familiar. After, it was something else entirely, a force that could turn without warning, a force that didn't care how tough you were, how experienced, how careful. Standing on that altered coastline, staring at a horizon that looked calm and harmless again, the survivors all shared the same unspoken thought. If it could happen once, it could bloody well happen again. In the months after Cyclone Mahina, Bathurst Bay never really recovered. You can rebuild huts, you can replace boats, But you can't undo what that storm did to people's heads or to the land itself. The official death toll was never nailed down. Records were patchy, names misspelt, or missing entirely. Some estimates said just over 300. Others reckoned 400, maybe more. The truth is, no one knows. Whole crews vanished. Aboriginal families were wiped out without ever being counted. Men went to sea and were never seen again, not even a scrap of timber to mark where they'd been. Queensland authorities eventually acknowledged the scale of the disaster, but by then the moment had passed. Australia was still a young country, focused on growth, on industry, on moving forward. Mahina didn't fit the story. It was too remote, too uncomfortable. Too many of the dead were people society barely noticed back then. So the storm faded from the national memory, even as it remained burned into the north. Slowly, changes did come. The pearling industry shifted its practices. Camps were moved to higher ground. Boats anchored differently, further apart. Weather stations expanded. Barometers became more common, and over time, systems improved so warnings could travel faster than wind and water. It didn't bring back the dead, but it meant fewer families would be blindsided in the same way. For the survivors, the impact lasted a lifetime. John O'Macleod eventually left the sea. He took work inland, far from the coast. People said he was never the same. He jumped at sudden noises. He hated still, hot days. Daza Ing stayed in the north but refused to camp near the beach again. He trusted mangroves more than open sand, said they felt like they held their ground better. Sheila Dawes remarried years later, built a quiet life down south. But those close to her knew that every anniversary of the storm, she went silent for a day, carrying a grief she never shared. The environment told its own story. Dunes formed by the storm remained long after, strange scars on the landscape. After heavy rain, bits of rusted metal and old timber still surfaced, as if the ground itself was refusing to forget. Traditional owners spoke of that night for generations, warning their kids about the sea's temper, about listening to the land when it goes quiet. O'Day. Cyclone Mahina stands as a brutal reminder of Australia's vulnerability, not just to wind and water, but to complacency, to thinking we've seen it all, to assuming we'll get a fair warning next time. Nature doesn't owe us that. Mahina proved that in the most violent way possible. T also exposed something harder to swallow, how easily lives can be lost, and then lost again, when they're not properly remembered. The deadliest storm in our history, and most Australians couldn't tell you its name. Yet out there on that stretch of far north Queensland coast, the land remembers, the sea remembers, and the families who carry those stories remember too. You sit there now, safe and dry. Imagine standing on that beach in 1899. No forecast, no sirens, just a hot, silent afternoon and a gut feeling you couldn't explain. What would you have done? How old would you have been when Mahina tore through Australia? And if your family has stories of cyclones, floods, bushfires, or nights when everything nearly disappeared, share them below. Because disasters like this don't just belong to the past. They shape who we are, and they deserve to be remembered.